Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might make you squirm a little. Imagine living in luxury, surrounded by riches and grandeur. Yet still, hygiene is a concept that just doesn't seem to quite make it onto the royal agenda. Sounds like a bad joke, right? Well, buckle up, because, trust me, you probably won't survive this deep dive into the unthinkable hygiene practices of royal women throughout history, the kind of hygiene that would have modern healthcare professionals gasping for air. You'd think that with all that wealth and power, cleanliness would be a top priority, but not so much. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Bob V, picture this. It's the royal court, the grandest palace imaginable, with its polished floors and golden chandeliers. The smell of rich perfumes mingles in the air, and every corner glimmers with decadence. But there's a catch, a big one. Despite all the opulence, royal women across history often overlooked one very important thing: personal hygiene. You may assume that royals, being in the lap of luxury, would have access to the best hygiene practices, but what you'll soon discover is that in many royal courts, cleanliness was anything but a priority. For some royal women, personal hygiene was often pushed aside in favor of appearance, power, and politics. It wasn't just about dirt, it was about keeping up appearances, and sometimes using the illusion of cleanliness to mask the realities of life in the past. Sounds bizarre, right? But it's true. Let's take a look at how these queens and princesses navigated hygiene, or lack thereof. To begin, let's talk about something you might think was a given in the royal world: bathing. Now, we all know that water is key to hygiene, and we assume that the wealthiest women in history would have bathed regularly. But you'd be wrong. Bathing, in fact, was a luxury that not even the richest royal women enjoyed often. You may find it hard to believe, but some royal women would only bathe once a year. Yes, you heard that right, once a year. It was thought that excessive bathing could open the pores and allow harmful diseases to enter the body, which, in hindsight, seems like an extremely questionable decision. These women would cover themselves in layers of perfume, oils, and powders to mask the stench of sweat and unwashed skin. It wasn't so much about being clean as it was about appearing clean. Historians still argue whether it was ignorance of hygiene or simply an obsession with maintaining an idealized image that led to such infrequent bathing. At the time, it was believed that perfumes, not soap and water, were the answer to the grime. A royal woman would often be doused in such a heavy fragrance that the true scent of her body was hidden beneath layers of sweetness. It was almost as though the more perfume she wore, the less she needed to care about basic cleanliness. You might be wondering if anyone called them out for this bizarre practice. But in a world of political intrigue and power, personal hygiene was the least of their concerns. Those royal courts were teeming with scandals, alliances, and betrayals, and, quite frankly, personal hygiene was far from the top of anyone's agenda. In fact, it wasn't just royal women who adhered to these strange hygiene practices. A whole societal structure was built around the idea that the wealthy had access to privileges that the poor could not afford, and cleanliness was certainly part of that system. With such little focus on personal care, it's no wonder that diseases would often spread through royal courts like wildfire. When you live in a space where hygiene isn't a top priority, there are bound to be consequences. And indeed, there were. Royal courts were notorious breeding grounds for illness. Bubonic plague, smallpox, and other diseases thrived in the unsanitary conditions, often claiming the lives of royals despite their apparent wealth. Yet this was just the beginning of a long history of hygiene habits that would make modern-day royal women cringe. Even today, when we think of royal hygiene, we imagine immaculate grooming, flawless beauty routines, and an air of cleanliness. But that was far from the case during much of history. Royal women were often surrounded by servants and personal attendants, yet despite having access to numerous resources, they did very little in the way of self-care. The concept of personal hygiene, as we know it, simply didn't exist in the same way during these periods. Some royal women didn't see the need for constant bathing or washing, preferring to rely on cosmetic tricks to maintain their outward appearance. Imagine living in a time when the idea of cleanliness was so foreign that it was actually seen as an indulgence, a waste of time even. It's a strange reality, but it's one that was true for many royal women. After all, when you've got an entire court watching your every move, cleanliness often takes a back seat to image and political maneuvering. This was only one small part of the hygiene chaos that defined their daily lives. Their personal practices would probably make us squirm today, but to them it was simply the norm. Now let's continue uncovering the less than glamorous aspects of royal hygiene throughout history. Now that we've covered the shocking lack of bathing, let's dive into another hygiene practice that might make you cringe. Hair care. Imagine this. You're a royal woman living in a lavish palace, surrounded by the finest things money can buy. You have servants at your beck and call, endless riches, and a reputation to maintain. Surely, with all this wealth, personal hygiene would be a top priority, right? Well, think again. Despite the grandeur surrounding them, many royal women throughout history took a very different approach to caring for their hair. In fact, many of them went weeks, even months, without washing it. Yes, you read that right. No shampoo, no conditioner, just layers upon layers of oils, powders and perfumes to mask the grime. Back then, cleanliness wasn't the top concern, appearance was. To the royal women of history, hair wasn't about maintaining its health or cleanliness, it was about looking good for the court and the public eye. For some, that meant they would go weeks without ever so much as dipping a comb in water. Why? Because it was believed that washing hair too often could remove its natural oils, leading to it becoming dry and lifeless. Instead, royal women used all sorts of methods to keep their hair looking presentable, even if it wasn't clean by modern standards. One of the common methods was to apply powders to the hair, such as chalk, which would absorb excess oils and dirt. Sometimes these powders were made from things like ground oats or flour, creating an odd texture that wasn't exactly the fresh, soft hair we envision today. But to these royal women, as long as their hair looked voluminous, shiny and styled correctly, that's all that mattered. Historians still argue whether this obsession with appearance over cleanliness was rooted in a lack of understanding about hygiene, or if it was simply a social trend, shaped by the priorities of the time. Now, let's talk about the products they used. Royal women often applied animal fats like bear grease to their hair. Imagine slathering your scalp with greasy bear fat. Gross, right? These oils made the hair look shiny, but they didn't exactly cleanse it. In fact, they likely left the hair greasy and sticky. In some royal courts, women didn't even bother to wash their hair regularly because they relied on the heavy oils to style and hold their hair in place, particularly in complex updos and elaborate hairstyles. After all, the whole idea behind hair care for royals wasn't about hygiene, it was about maintaining an image. A filthy scalp was still fine, as long as the hair looked presentable from a distance. This emphasis on style over cleanliness was in part a result of the social hierarchy. The more royal a woman was, the more pressure she faced to appear immaculate, regardless of the reality. Hair was a symbol of status. Long, thick, and well-styled hair was a sign of power and beauty. But rather than maintaining the health of the hair, royal women focused on making sure it looked just the way they wanted it to look. For some, this meant not washing their hair at all. After all, why go through the trouble of cleaning it when you could just hide the dirt beneath layers of powder, oils, and perfume? While it may sound shocking to us today, this practice was so widespread that even servants and attendants were often called upon to help maintain the illusion of cleanliness. Servants would spend hours combing and styling the royal women's hair, carefully concealing the oils and dirt. It was a performance of beauty, not a commitment to hygiene. What's even more fascinating is that royal women weren't the only ones who followed this strange practice. Some of the wealthiest and most powerful men also took part in similar hair care routines. In fact, male royals often wore wigs made from human hair or horsehair, which could sometimes be just as unclean as the natural hair they replaced. The wigs were often designed to be so extravagant that the cleanliness of the wearer's real hair became irrelevant. Whether natural or wigged, as long as the hair looked pristine and in place, everything was fine. The strange thing about royal hair care was that it wasn't entirely out of fear of diseases or a lack of access to water. Many royal courts had access to plenty of water sources, and they certainly could have washed their hair if they wanted to, but cleanliness was just not a priority. Hygiene was often seen as an afterthought, or worse, as something that could interfere with an image of perfection. The more you think about it, the more it seems as though personal hygiene was more of an aesthetic choice than a practical one. Historians still argue about why this trend persisted for so long. Some believe that it was simply a matter of practicality. Washing hair could have been seen as too much of a hassle, especially with all the royal duties to attend to. Others think it was driven by the perception that dirt and oils could be hidden from view, thus maintaining the illusion of beauty without actually needing to clean the hair. Regardless of the reason, the impact of these practices was far-reaching. Over time, these hygiene habits became deeply ingrained in the culture of royalty, further perpetuating the idea that looking clean was more important than being clean. And let's not forget that many of these royal women spent hours getting ready for court or public appearances, all in the name of keeping up with the image of cleanliness. But beneath those immaculate gowns and meticulously styled wigs, things were far less pristine. In conclusion, royal women's hair care habits were nothing short of bizarre by modern standards. These women were obsessed with appearance to the point of neglecting basic hygiene. Hair, as a symbol of beauty and power, had to look perfect at all costs, and the cleanliness of the scalp simply didn't matter. While we might be appalled at the idea of going months without washing our hair, it was just another day in the life of a royal woman trying to balance power, beauty, and image. End of section. Lee and Tai. As we continue to uncover the unthinkable hygiene practices of royal women, let's turn our attention to something that most of us take for granted: oral hygiene. Imagine this: you're a royal woman, living in the lap of luxury, surrounded by all the finest things, yet when it comes to taking care of your teeth and mouth, things get complicated. While we may think that brushing our teeth is essential to good hygiene, in royal courts of the past, it was far from a priority. In fact, many royal women never brushed their teeth at all, and some didn't even know what a toothbrush was. Let's take a step back and examine what the reality was like. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent in many royal courts. Toothbrushes were a modern invention that didn't come into widespread use until much later, and toothpaste? Forget it. So, how did royal women maintain their oral health, or lack thereof? Well, in many cases, they didn't. The idea of regularly cleaning your teeth wasn't a part of their daily routine, and it was common for royals to rely on some rather questionable practices to manage oral hygiene. Instead of brushing, royal women often used a variety of substances to freshen their breath or clean their teeth. Some would use powders made from crushed bones, charcoal, or even ground up herbs, hoping these would somehow keep their teeth from decaying or their breath from smelling foul. But as you can imagine, these methods were nowhere near as effective as modern toothpaste. Instead of preventing dental decay, these powders often did more harm than good, causing wear and tear on the teeth. If you think it can't get worse, just wait. Some royal women relied on something far more peculiar to keep their breath fresh: urine. Yes, urine. In a bizarre twist, urine was sometimes used as a mouthwash. It was believed that the ammonia in urine could whiten teeth and fight off foul odors. This might sound like an absurd idea today, but back then it was actually a fairly common practice. The use of urine, particularly from children or young women, was a popular remedy for dental problems. Not only did it smell terrible, but it likely caused more harm than good to the teeth and gums. In some royal courts, it was also common for women to wear intricate dental devices made of gold or other metals, which were meant to disguise missing teeth or imperfections. While these devices may have been stylish, they certainly weren't hygienic. A lack of proper oral care meant that many royal women suffered from tooth decay, gum disease, and bad breath. However, the appearance of their teeth was considered far more important than their health. Historians still argue about the true extent of dental neglect in royal courts. Some scholars believe that royal women may have simply ignored their dental health because it was not seen as a priority in the face of political pressures and public appearances. Others argue that it was a matter of ignorance. Many royal women simply didn't have access to the same level of medical knowledge or resources that we do today. However, one thing is certain: the idea of having a gleaming smile or healthy teeth wasn't something most royal women cared about. Instead, they were more concerned with keeping up appearances, whether that meant wearing gold dental devices or simply masking the odor with perfume. Let's not forget that while royal women might have neglected their teeth, they were often the subjects of intense scrutiny and were expected to appear flawless. Their beauty, especially their smiles, was closely tied to their status, which makes it all the more ironic that their dental health was so neglected. In fact, royal women often relied on heavy cosmetics and perfumes to mask any signs of poor hygiene. If their breath was bad or their teeth decayed, it wasn't about the lack of care. It was about concealing the reality of it all. It wasn't just the royals who suffered from poor dental hygiene either. The entire royal court often reflected this neglect. Court physicians and attendants were more likely to focus on more pressing matters, such as keeping the royal family alive during plagues or assisting with childbirth, than on ensuring good oral health. There simply wasn't enough understanding of how to properly care for teeth at the time, and as a result, dental health often took a backseat to other concerns. Despite this, there was an enduring belief in the power of cosmetics and other superficial methods to cover up these issues. When it comes to oral hygiene, royal women of the past were far from the pristine, well-groomed images we have today. Their dental care, if you can even call it that, was focused on appearance, not health. Whether it was using urine as mouthwash or wearing gold dental devices to hide missing teeth, the lack of attention to proper oral hygiene reflects just how different the standards of beauty and cleanliness were during that time. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on the evolution of dental care. Modern dentistry has made tremendous advancements, and the importance of brushing our teeth has become widely understood. We take it for granted today, but the fact is, these royal women lived in a world where dental neglect was just a part of everyday life, and beauty was often achieved at the expense of health. We've now covered the royal neglect of bathing and hair care, as well as the shocking dental practices of yesteryear. But let's move on to another crucial aspect of hygiene, the use of perfumes. You might think that a royal woman, surrounded by the finest luxuries, would prioritize cleanliness and avoid masking odors with heavy fragrances. However, the opposite was often true. For many royal women, perfume wasn't just a beauty accessory, it was a necessity, and not always for the reasons you might think. In an era where regular bathing wasn't considered important, perfume became the primary tool for masking body odor. A heavy dose of fragrance was the easiest way to conceal the natural scent of the body. Imagine a royal woman sitting on her ornate throne, surrounded by courtiers, all of whom were equally accustomed to the oppressive layers of perfume. It wasn't about smelling good, it was about hiding the fact that no one had bathed in days, or even weeks. For royal women, perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a survival tool. Perfume was so central to royal life that it became a status symbol. The more elaborate the fragrance, the more important you were. Royals and aristocrats often wore custom-made perfumes, designed to be overpowering and long-lasting. Some of the most famous royal women, like Queen Elizabeth I of England, were known for using perfumes to cover up their lack of personal hygiene. Elizabeth, for example, was rumoured to have bathed only once a month, but she regularly doused herself in perfumes, hoping the scent would mask her body odour and give the impression of cleanliness. The use of perfumes wasn't limited to just women, though. Royal men, too, would often overdo it with the scent. At the French court, for instance, King Louis XV's excessive use of perfume became legendary. The court was infamous for its strong smells, and Louis XV's personal fragrance was said to be so potent that it became a part of his identity. He and his court would often use perfumes, oils, and other strong-smelling substances to cover up the stench of bodies that hadn't seen soap or water in days. But the dependence on perfume didn't stop at just body odor. In fact, perfume was considered an essential part of personal care. Royals would often wear elaborate floral and citrus-scented perfumes as a way to ensure they didn't smell unpleasant. Even if their bodies were dirty, they made sure that their external appearance and scent remained dignified. If you couldn't bathe regularly, at least you could smell like you had. One of the most common ingredients in these royal perfumes was rosewater, a fragrance that was believed to have both refreshing and purifying properties. Royals were known to have rosewater baths, but rather than actually cleaning themselves, the rosewater would merely be used to mask their natural scent. It's a perfect example of how royal women, and indeed many in the upper classes, would rely on external appearance over internal cleanliness. To these women, cleanliness wasn't about removing dirt, but about presenting an illusion of freshness and purity. But the use of perfume also came with its own set of problems. Since royal women often doused themselves in heavy, fragrant oils and powders, they would often suffer from skin problems. Heavy oils could clog pores and lead to rashes or acne, which of course had to be covered up with even more cosmetics. It was an endless cycle of hiding the reality behind layers of scent, makeup and fabric. Perfume might mask the smell, but it certainly didn't make anyone healthier or clean. It simply perpetuated the illusion that cleanliness was being maintained. Historians still argue whether the overuse of perfume was due to a lack of knowledge about hygiene, or whether it was simply a cultural norm at the time. Some suggest that perfume use was less about hygiene and more about class distinctions, since only the wealthiest could afford such indulgences. Others believe that it was a practical solution to the lack of bathing facilities and water. Regardless of the reason, the widespread use of perfume became a symbol of power and wealth, an external representation of the royal woman's image of cleanliness. However misleading that might have been, perfume, in essence, became a substitute for personal hygiene. It was an easier, more acceptable solution to the fact that many royal women didn't bathe regularly. Rather than facing the social consequences of smelling unpleasant or dirty, royals could simply rely on strong fragrances to cover up the truth. The higher the rank of the individual, the more elaborate the perfume. It was the ultimate status symbol. In a world where bathing was seen as a dangerous or unnecessary activity, perfumes were the easiest way for royal women to maintain an appearance of cleanliness, despite the glaring truth that they rarely washed themselves. They could still walk into a room and command attention with the sweet, overpowering smell of their custom-made fragrances. And that, in the world of royalty, was all that mattered. The use of perfume became more than just a daily necessity. It was woven into the very fabric of court life. It was a performance, a way of telling the world that despite their lack of hygiene, these women were still above reproach. The reliance on scent to mask reality speaks volumes about how royalty prioritized their image over personal health. The longer you think about it, the more you realize that in royal courts, cleanliness was a luxury only reserved for the few who had the time, energy, and inclination to focus on it. For the majority, perfume was their only line of defense. Now, we've already covered bathing, hair care, dental hygiene, and the power of perfume in royal life. But there's still one more area that needs our attention: The undergarments worn by royal women. Yes, the very garments that we rarely think about, but which were often a source of filth and discomfort in the past. When you think about royal women in grand palaces, you probably envision them in extravagant gowns adorned with jewels and intricate lace. What you might not realize, though, is that underneath those layers of fabric, the hygiene practices were far from glamorous. You might be surprised to learn that, for much of history, royal women didn't often wear clean underwear. In fact, the concept of laundering undergarments was almost non-existent in certain periods. This was especially true for women in the medieval and Renaissance periods, where the wearing of undergarments was often considered secondary to appearance and status. While upper-class women wore layers of clothing to maintain their dignity, hygiene was rarely a consideration. The undergarments, when they were worn, were often made from rough fabrics that didn't breathe well and were rarely washed. Take the 16th century, for example. Royal women like Queen Elizabeth I and her contemporaries often wore chemises, which were linen shirts worn beneath their gowns. These garments were seen as basic layers to protect the expensive outerwear from sweat and oils from the skin. But while these chemises may have been meant to protect the outer clothing, they weren't washed regularly, which led to a buildup of sweat, dirt, and body odor. Imagine wearing the same unwashed linen garment day in and day out, without the benefit of modern washing machines. It's no wonder that royal women had such limited personal hygiene. Undergarments, such as petticoats and shifts, were often made of heavy, coarse materials like wool or unrefined cotton. These fabrics, while durable, were far from comfortable or breathable. They trapped heat and moisture, making it all too easy for bacteria and sweat to accumulate. Over time, this caused rashes, infections, and even unpleasant odors. For many royal women, changing their undergarments was not a regular practice, and instead they would rely on external layers such as fragrant powders and perfumes to cover up the smells. These powders often did little to improve the situation, instead acting as another layer of mask over the unpleasant realities of life. Let's also consider the fact that women in these royal courts were often busy with their royal duties and public appearances, leaving them with little time to worry about personal hygiene. They spent hours preparing for state events, political meetings, and royal dinners, and personal comfort took a backseat to these obligations. Changing out of an undergarment or shifting into a clean chemise simply wasn't on the agenda when there were more pressing matters at hand, such as maintaining a perfect image for the public or managing political affairs. Historians still argue whether the lack of focus on undergarment cleanliness was due to ignorance or a societal norm. Some believe that it was simply accepted that royals, particularly women, didn't need to bother with mundane issues like clean clothing or personal care. Others argue that it was more about practicality and social expectations. After all, these women had servants and attendants to help maintain their outward appearance, and no one really questioned the state of their undergarments. It was more important to look pristine in your formal attire than to worry about what was underneath. It wasn't until the later centuries, with the rise of hygiene awareness and more modern conveniences, that royal women began to address the issue of undergarment cleanliness. By the 18th and 19th centuries, corsets and other undergarments became more refined, but the idea of washing or changing them regularly still lagged behind. Despite improvements in fabric and washing techniques, many women still faced the uncomfortable reality of wearing undergarments that were rarely cleaned. By the time we reached the 20th century, hygiene standards in royal courts had improved, but the history of neglecting undergarment cleanliness is a glaring example of how royal women, despite their wealth and status, often put appearance over comfort and cleanliness. The idea of personal hygiene and cleanliness as we know it today simply didn't apply in the same way during their time. The use of unwashed undergarments was yet another part of a broader culture of neglect when it came to personal hygiene, despite the lavish lifestyle of the royal courts. For royal women, image was everything, no matter how uncomfortable or unhygienic their undergarments may have been. Much like the other aspects of their hygiene routines, the focus was on presenting an idealized version of themselves to the public, not on the reality of their personal cleanliness. In conclusion, royal women's undergarments were a perfect reflection of the hygiene practices of their time, unwashed, uncomfortable, and overlooked. These garments were often worn for long periods without being replaced, leading to unpleasant odors and the growth of bacteria. And while they may have been hidden beneath layers of fine clothing, the neglect of basic hygiene was still very much a part of life in the royal courts. Whether they wore perfume, powder, or simply relied on the illusion of cleanliness, the truth was that royal women's undergarments were just another aspect of a deeply flawed system of personal care. Now that we've covered the unwashed undergarments and the many layers of perfume used by royal women, let's take a look at another critical yet neglected area, the royal bathroom practices. In today's world, bathrooms are a private sanctuary where people go to freshen up and maintain personal hygiene. But in the royal courts of history, the concept of a bathroom wasn't quite what we think of today. In fact, the royal restrooms, or rather, the lack thereof, were often far from sanitary, even by royal standards. Imagine being a queen or a princess in the medieval or Renaissance periods. You're dressed in layers of luxurious fabrics, and you're surrounded by attendants who cater to your every need. But when it comes time to take care of nature's call, you might find yourself heading to a chamber pot, a rather primitive and unhygienic solution to the problem. These chamber pots were often used for both urination and defecation, and were frequently placed under beds or in small, enclosed spaces within royal rooms. Once the pot was full, it was dumped, sometimes by servants, other times by the royal women themselves, into a larger container or tossed out of the window into the streets below. If you can imagine the smell and the unsanitary conditions, you're getting close to the reality. These royal bathrooms were typically not cleaned regularly, as hygiene wasn't considered a top priority. Instead, the focus was placed on maintaining an image of wealth and power, not cleanliness. The idea of a private, clean and sanitary bathroom didn't exist, and this lack of hygiene was common throughout many royal courts. While chamber pots and makeshift toilets were the norm, they were still a far cry from what we would consider adequate sanitation today. But it wasn't just the toilets themselves that were unhygienic, it was the entire process of relieving oneself in the royal courts. Women in particular had to deal with elaborate gowns, corsets and layers of clothing, making it incredibly difficult to use the bathroom efficiently. In fact, royal women often required the assistance of attendants to help them remove their clothing in order to go to the bathroom, leading to a long and cumbersome process. Historians still argue about whether the lack of sanitary bathroom practices in royal courts was due to ignorance or simply a result of the social norms of the time. It's likely a combination of both. After all, royalty at the time was more concerned with politics, appearance, and wealth than with maintaining personal hygiene. The idea of cleanliness, particularly in the realm of bathroom practices, was either too inconvenient or deemed unnecessary for those at the top of the social ladder. As royal women were often not expected to perform basic tasks, like using the toilet on their own, they became even more reliant on servants to manage their hygiene. The idea of self-care was foreign to many royal women, and it was common for them to have attendants on hand to help with the most basic of bodily functions. This further emphasizes the degree to which personal hygiene was neglected. After all, if you can't even use the bathroom without assistance, you're not exactly concerned with cleanliness in other aspects of your life. The royal courts of Europe were notorious for their lack of cleanliness in many areas, and the bathroom was no exception. This neglect of hygiene, particularly in terms of bathroom practices, led to the spread of disease and contributed to the poor health of many royal families. While royals were often seen as immune to the common problems that plagued the lower classes, they were by no means exempt from the consequences of poor sanitation. Many royal courts were rife with illnesses, some of which could have been avoided with better hygiene practices, particularly in the realm of bathroom care. Interestingly, while the lack of bathrooms was a problem in royal courts, there were periods in history when royalty was obsessed with creating luxurious bathrooms of their own. In ancient Rome, for example, emperors and nobility used complex bathhouses and toilets made of marble, complete with running water systems. But this concept didn't last, and as the medieval period took hold, these advanced sanitation systems fell out of favor. The royal courts of Europe regressed into more primitive, unhygienic bathroom practices, which remained the norm for centuries. By the 18th century, things began to change, albeit slowly. The rise of indoor plumbing, the invention of the flush toilet, and the growing awareness of sanitation all contributed to the eventual improvements in bathroom hygiene. However, it wasn't until the Victorian era that the royal courts of Europe started to truly embrace modern sanitation practices. Even then, royal women would often continue to rely on the assistance of servants for basic personal hygiene. In conclusion, the royal bathroom practices were a far cry from the sanitized, private experiences we enjoy today. Chamber pots, poorly maintained bathrooms, and a lack of personal responsibility for hygiene were just a few of the ways in which royal women neglected cleanliness. Their bathroom habits, while largely hidden from public view, were yet another example of the vast difference between the image of perfection royalty portrayed and the reality of their unhygienic lifestyle. The royal neglect of bathroom hygiene, combined with other practices like the lack of bathing, poor hair care, and unwashed undergarments, paints a picture of a time when appearance was prioritized over cleanliness, and the wealth and luxury of royal life couldn't hide the unsanitary truth. As we continue our journey through the hygiene practices of royal women, let's explore one of the most troubling aspects of their lives, the health and wellness practices they followed. We might think that royalty, with their access to the finest doctors, food and resources, would be in top health. Unfortunately, this wasn't always the case. Many royal women were subjected to bizarre medical treatments and wellness practices that would make modern doctors shudder. These treatments were often aimed at maintaining beauty, fertility, or overall wellness, but at times they were downright dangerous. Take for instance the use of lead-based cosmetics. Lead was a common ingredient in makeup used by royal women, as it was believed to give the skin a smooth, pale appearance. Pale skin was highly prized at the time, as it was seen as a sign of nobility, indicating that one didn't have to work outside in the sun. But using lead-based cosmetics came with severe consequences. Lead is a toxic substance, and prolonged exposure to it caused lead poisoning, which could lead to hair loss, severe headaches, and in some cases death. Royal women often suffered from the side effects of these beauty treatments, yet they continued to use them in pursuit of an idealized pale complexion. One of the most famous examples of a royal woman suffering from the side effects of beauty treatments is Queen Elizabeth I of England. The Queen's pale face was the result of layers of white lead-based paint that she applied daily. As the years went on, Elizabeth's skin became thin and pockmarked, and she developed a visible deterioration in her health. It was reported that she wore heavy layers of makeup to cover the damage caused by the lead, but it was too late. Her beauty rituals were ultimately contributing to her decline, as the lead caused irreversible damage to her skin. Beyond cosmetics, royal women often subjected themselves to bizarre medical practices in an attempt to stay youthful and healthy. One of the most common methods was bloodletting, a practice where doctors would draw blood from the patient to balance their humors, as it was believed that sickness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. This practice was widely used in royal courts for centuries, despite the fact that it often did more harm than good. Bloodletting could lead to severe anemia, weakness, and even death, but it was considered a legitimate treatment for everything from headaches to fevers to digestive issues. Another bizarre wellness practice was the use of herbal remedies. While some herbs and plants do have medicinal properties, many of the concoctions royal women ingested were ineffective at best and dangerous at worst. Some women consumed toxic plants like belladonna or used mercury-based treatments which could cause poisoning and even death. But despite the dangers, these practices continued, often under the guidance of royal physicians who believed in these outdated treatments. Historians still debate whether these medical practices were a result of ignorance, or if they were driven by the belief that only the most luxurious, extravagant treatments could ensure a royal woman's beauty and health. Either way, the result was the same. Royal women often found themselves in worse health than they would have been if they had stuck to more modern medical practices. One example of this is the use of arsenic-based treatments. Some royal women took arsenic to maintain their youthful appearance, as it was believed to help with skin tone and smoothness. Arsenic, of course, is a deadly poison, and prolonged exposure to it can lead to organ failure, blindness, and death. Yet, for centuries, arsenic was used in royal courts as part of beauty regimens, even though it came with severe consequences. The sad irony here is that these royal women, who had access to the best resources, were often the victims of their own vanity. They could have had the best medical care, but they were so wrapped up in the pursuit of beauty and wellness that they allowed themselves to fall prey to harmful and outdated practices. The toll these beauty and wellness rituals took on their bodies is a stark reminder that even the wealthiest and most powerful women were not immune to the dangers of poor medical knowledge and self-destructive beauty ideals. In some cases, the pressure to maintain an image of health and beauty led to significant emotional and mental distress. Many royal women were expected to maintain an appearance of perfection at all times, regardless of the toll it took on their physical or mental health. This relentless pressure often led to feelings of isolation, anxiety, and depression. The stress of living up to these expectations, combined with harmful beauty practices and medical treatments, left many royal women in poor health by the end of their lives. What's more, many of these royal women had limited control over their own bodies. They were often treated as political pawns, with their health and beauty being manipulated for the sake of alliances, marriages, and the production of heirs. Their personal well-being was often sacrificed for the greater good of the royal family or the monarchy itself. They had little say in the treatments they received or the beauty practices they were expected to follow. In conclusion, the wellness and health practices of royal women were, for the most part, severely flawed and often damaging. While they had access to the best physicians and resources, their beauty and health were sacrificed at the altar of vanity and political necessity. Lead-based cosmetics, bloodletting, toxic herbal remedies, and arsenic treatments were just a few of the dangerous practices royal women endured in their pursuit of beauty and health. These practices were a reflection of a time when the appearance of wellness mattered more than actual well-being, and they left many royal women suffering from long-term physical and emotional damage. The wealth and luxury they enjoyed were no guarantee of good health or hygiene, and in many cases their efforts to maintain their royal image led to a life of pain and suffering. Many royal women led to a life of pain and suffering. As we've seen, royal women faced significant challenges in terms of their personal hygiene, and much of it stemmed from an intense focus on appearances over actual cleanliness. But let's now look at another fascinating and somewhat appalling aspect of royal life, the general state of their clothing. While the royals might have had access to the finest fabrics, their clothing was far from the sanitary, easy-to-wear outfits we have today. In fact, the lavish gowns, corsets, and intricate garments worn by royal women were often breeding grounds for filth, bacteria, and discomfort. For starters, many royal women wore clothing made from heavy, often unwashed fabrics like silk, velvet, and wool. These fabrics were often so thick and cumbersome that they didn't allow for proper air circulation, making it difficult for the body to stay cool and dry. As a result, sweat would accumulate and linger on the skin, leading to an increase in body odor. But it wasn't just sweat that was trapped by these garments. It was also dirt and oils from the body. The layers upon layers of clothing could make it nearly impossible for royal women to stay clean, especially since changing clothes regularly wasn't always an option. The sheer weight of these garments also meant that it would be uncomfortable to wear anything else underneath, leading to more layers of unclean fabric against the skin. As if the fabrics themselves weren't enough of a problem, the actual process of dressing could be an exhausting and unhygienic affair. Royal women were often helped by attendants and servants to get dressed. After all, these gowns could weigh dozens of pounds and required multiple layers to be properly put together. But once the dress was on, it was often left on for days or even weeks without being washed. Changing into a fresh outfit was considered unnecessary for royal women, especially since they had so many important public appearances and events to attend. This meant that their clothing, which was designed to impress, became a repository for sweat, oils, dust, and dirt. Consider this. Royal women of past centuries rarely had the ability to wash their clothes as we do today. The concept of laundering especially in a manner that could remove bacteria and dirt thoroughly, was virtually non-existent. Instead, garments were aired out or simply shaken and brushed off, with perfume or powder applied to mask any lingering odors. For instance, during the Renaissance, royal women often used scented sachets sewn into their garments to cover up the stench of unwashed clothes and bodies. While this might sound familiar to the perfume over bathing strategy we saw earlier, it didn't exactly address the root cause of the problem, the lack of cleanliness. Some royal garments, especially corsets and other restrictive clothing, also created problems for personal hygiene. Corsets, often worn by royal women to achieve the desired slim waistline, were tightly laced and left little room for the body to move or breathe. This could lead to sweat buildup, irritation and rashes, especially when worn for long periods without any change of clothing. The corset became an almost permanent fixture in a royal woman's wardrobe, and the discomfort it caused was accepted as a price to pay for beauty and status. But as we know today, wearing tight clothing that traps sweat against the skin for long periods can lead to all sorts of skin issues, including fungal infections and heat rashes. And let's not forget the role of undergarments, or rather, the lack thereof. As we mentioned earlier, royal women didn't have the modern comfort of regularly washed undergarments. In many cases, their underwear was made of rough fabrics and worn repeatedly without cleaning. The long, stiff dresses and corsets they wore meant that changing into fresh undergarments was often an afterthought, and since the importance of cleanliness was often overlooked, it wasn't uncommon for royal women to have the same underwear on for days at a time. This not only contributed to discomfort, but also to poor hygiene. Without regular laundering, these garments would quickly become breeding grounds for bacteria, leading to unpleasant odors and possible infection. Another hygiene issue was the use of expensive fabrics that didn't allow for the same kind of washing techniques we use today. Fabrics like silk and velvet were delicate and could be damaged if washed too frequently, so they were often not cleaned at all. Instead, they would be brushed, shaken, and aired out, methods that were ineffective in removing dirt and bacteria. The heavy use of perfume and powder was meant to disguise the unpleasant smells that would arise from unwashed fabrics, but this was just another layer of the illusion of cleanliness. The reality was that royal women were often wearing clothes that were, at best, only marginally clean, and at worst, deeply unsanitary. Historians argue that the neglect of clothing hygiene in royal courts was partly due to the value placed on outward appearance and social status. Royal women were expected to look pristine, and their clothing was seen as a symbol of their wealth and power. The idea of changing into clean, comfortable clothes was simply not in line with the image of the flawless, regal woman. The heavy layers, tight corsets, and fragile fabrics were all part of the performance of royalty. No one questioned the cleanliness of their clothing, even when it became clear that wearing the same garment for days on end was contributing to poor hygiene. In conclusion, the clothing worn by royal women throughout history was often a significant factor in their overall lack of hygiene. From heavy, unwashed fabrics to restrictive corsets and undergarments, royal women were trapped in a cycle of discomfort and unsanitary conditions, all in the name of beauty and status. The pressure to maintain an idealized image of royalty overshadowed any consideration of cleanliness, and as a result, their clothing became a silent accomplice to their neglect of personal hygiene. These garments, which were meant to convey wealth and power, often hid the unsanitary reality of royal life. Let's now move on to yet another area where royal women's hygiene practices fell short: their approach to health during pregnancy. You might think that in the royal courts, where wealth and power were in abundance, these women would have access to the finest medical care during pregnancy. Sadly, this wasn't always the case. While royal women had access to skilled physicians and the best resources, the health practices surrounding pregnancy were often woefully inadequate, with many women enduring dangerous and uncomfortable conditions that would be unimaginable by modern standards. First, let's consider the importance of maternal health and hygiene during pregnancy in the royal courts. Today, pregnant women are often advised to follow strict guidelines to maintain a healthy pregnancy, including maintaining a balanced diet, getting regular prenatal checkups, and practicing good hygiene. But for royal women of the past, things were very different. Pregnancy was seen more as a political necessity than a time of personal well-being. Royal women were expected to bear heirs, to secure dynastic succession, and their health was often disregarded in favor of ensuring the production of a male heir. This led to dangerous and sometimes fatal medical practices being used on these women. Take, for example, the custom of fasting during pregnancy. It was believed by some royal physicians that a woman's body needed to be purified during pregnancy, and one method of purification was fasting. Royal women were often instructed to restrict their food intake, sometimes to the point of starvation, under the belief that it would benefit the health of both the mother and child. This practice was not only unhealthy, but it also contributed to malnutrition and other complications. As a result, many royal women suffered from anemia, weakness, and fatigue, which only made their pregnancies more difficult. Moreover, the lack of proper prenatal care meant that many royal women were left to endure difficult pregnancies without the support or medical interventions we have today. Women were often given questionable treatments, such as herbal concoctions and bloodletting, in an attempt to maintain their health during pregnancy. The use of herbs, while it may have had some medicinal value, was often based on superstitions rather than sound medical knowledge. Some herbs, like pennyroyal, were even used to induce miscarriages, putting both the woman's life and the pregnancy at risk. The hygiene practices surrounding childbirth were also a far cry from what we would consider safe today. While midwives were often called upon to assist with the birth, many royal women delivered their babies in less than sterile conditions. The idea of sterilizing medical instruments or ensuring clean hands and environments simply didn't exist in the same way it does now. Many royal women gave birth in their royal chambers, surrounded by attendants, family members, and sometimes even strangers, all in close proximity. The lack of hygiene in these situations led to many women suffering from infections, and in some cases it led to death. Perhaps the most tragic example of this was the death of Queen Henrietta Maria of France, wife of King Charles I of England. She died in 1669 after a difficult childbirth which was complicated by an infection. It was later discovered that unsanitary medical practices were partly to blame for her death. At the time, many royal women were unable to ensure proper hygiene during childbirth. Henrietta Maria's death is just one example of the many royal women who suffered from the poor medical practices surrounding pregnancy and childbirth. Even more shocking, however, was the practice of lying in after childbirth. After giving birth, royal women were often expected to remain in bed for several weeks to rest and recover. During this period, they were surrounded by family and attendants, but the conditions in these rooms were far from ideal. The bed linens, which had not been washed, would remain unchanged for days, if not weeks, leading to a build-up of sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids. The lack of fresh air and proper cleaning led to unpleasant odors and a breeding ground for bacteria. Royal women were often confined to these unsanitary environments, with little attention given to maintaining basic cleanliness. Historians still debate whether the lack of hygiene during pregnancy and childbirth was a result of ignorance, or whether it was simply a reflection of the societal norms of the time. It's likely that both factors played a role. Women in royal courts were treated as political assets, and their well-being was often secondary to their role in producing heirs. The lack of hygiene, combined with questionable medical practices, made pregnancy and childbirth dangerous for many royal women, and the consequences were often tragic. In conclusion, the hygiene practices surrounding pregnancy and childbirth in royal courts were often appalling, from fasting and malnutrition to unsanitary birthing conditions and postnatal care. Royal women suffered from the lack of medical knowledge and hygiene during this crucial time in their lives. Despite their wealth and status, these women were often subjected to harmful practices that compromised their health and well-being. The legacy of these practices is a reminder that even those at the highest levels of society were not immune to the dangers of poor hygiene and outdated medical practices. Now that we've explored the unsanitary conditions surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, let's take a look at something equally essential to a royal woman's life: her skin care, and the bizarre rituals she underwent to maintain it. Today, skin care is an industry worth billions, with people spending tons of money on lotions, creams, and face masks to keep their skin youthful and clear. But for royal women in centuries past, skincare was often far less about improving skin health and more about following odd rituals that had little to do with hygiene or the science of skincare. One common practice for royal women was the use of lead-based face paint to achieve the desired pale complexion. Pale skin was a symbol of wealth and nobility because it indicated that you didn't have to work in the fields and were thus exempt from sun exposure. While we might think that keeping your skin healthy means protecting it from the sun's harmful rays today, in royal courts of the past, it meant coating your face with dangerous substances. Lead-based cosmetics, which were often thick and opaque, were applied regularly to create the illusion of perfect, porcelain-like skin. However, lead is highly toxic, and prolonged exposure can lead to poisoning, hair loss, and neurological damage. Despite these dangers, royal women, especially during the Renaissance period, suffered through the use of these harmful cosmetics in their quest for beauty. Perhaps the most famous example of this practice was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The Queen was known for her strikingly pale appearance, which was the result of heavy use of white lead makeup. Over the years, her face became disfigured by the very substance she had used to maintain her youthful appearance. The skin around her eyes and mouth became deeply wrinkled and unhealthy, a clear sign of the damage caused by the lead-based face paint. Ironically, the Queen's obsession with maintaining a youthful, flawless complexion contributed to her deteriorating health. It wasn't just the face that was the focus of royal skincare rituals. Entire body treatments were used, often with equally questionable results. One such ritual involved the use of animal fats and oils as moisturizers. Bear grease, lard, and even human fat were applied to the skin in the belief that they would keep the skin soft and youthful. While these substances might have temporarily improved the appearance of the skin, they also clogged pores and attracted dirt, which in turn led to skin issues such as acne and rashes. The idea was that royal women could maintain smooth and supple skin by slathering themselves in greasy substances. But at what cost? Other royal women, especially in France, would use luxurious herbal baths as part of their skincare routine. While some herbs have beneficial properties for the skin, many of the concoctions used in these baths were more about luxury than effectiveness. For instance, many of the herbal baths used at the French court were made with flowers like lavender, rose petals, and chamomile. While these herbs may have had soothing properties, they did little to actually cleanse the skin or promote healthy skin function. In fact, many of these treatments were more about creating an atmosphere of relaxation and indulgence rather than improving skin health. Even the royal beauty regimen didn't stop at external treatments. Internal beauty rituals were also in place. Some royal women consumed strange and harmful concoctions to purify their skin. One of the more bizarre beauty practices was the use of mercury in cosmetics and skincare treatments. Mercury, which is highly toxic, was used in the form of ointments and creams in the belief that it could clear the skin and improve complexion. It wasn't uncommon for women in the royal courts to apply these dangerous creams in an effort to keep their skin clear and youthful looking. Unfortunately, these treatments often caused long-term harm, leading to mercury poisoning, which can cause serious health problems, including kidney damage and neurological disorders. Historians still debate whether these beauty rituals were fueled by a lack of knowledge about the consequences of using toxic substances, or if they were driven by the idea that royalty deserved to indulge in the most extravagant treatments, regardless of the potential risks. It is likely that both factors played a role. Royalty had access to the best physicians, but their understanding of health and hygiene was often limited by the medical knowledge of the time, and when beauty and status were at stake, many royal women were willing to endure whatever treatments were recommended, even if they were harmful. By today's standards, it's almost unimaginable that someone would willingly expose themselves to such toxic substances, all in the name of beauty. But for royal women of the past, the pursuit of an idealized image of beauty often outweighed the importance of health and safety. While their beauty rituals were far from effective in terms of skin health, they were certainly a reflection of the royal obsession with outward appearance and the lengths to which women went to maintain their status and beauty. In conclusion, the skin care practices of royal women were not only misguided but also potentially dangerous. The use of lead-based cosmetics, animal fats, mercury, and herbal concoctions all contributed to the neglect of actual skin health. Instead of focusing on hygiene or natural skincare methods, royal women were driven by the need to maintain an image of youth, beauty, and wealth. These practices were a reflection of a broader societal obsession with outward appearances, even at the cost of personal well-being. The irony, of course, is that while these royal women went to great lengths to preserve their beauty, they often found that the very substances they used to enhance their looks ended up damaging their health. As we've delved into the dangerous beauty practices, it's important to also look at the more subtle aspects of royal women's hygiene habits that often went unnoticed: their daily routines. These routines, while often seen as trivial by today's standards, were an integral part of royal life. They were designed to project an image of perfection and cleanliness to the public, but behind the scenes, they were far from sanitary. The concept of daily hygiene, as we understand it, simply didn't exist in the same way. The life of a royal woman, surrounded by wealth and servants, was one of constant performance, where maintaining the illusion of cleanliness was paramount, even if it meant neglecting the basics of personal care. One such aspect of royal women's daily hygiene routines was the process of dressing. As we've already discussed, the clothes they wore were heavy and cumbersome, designed not for comfort, but for the appearance of power and wealth. These garments were often tight-fitting, layered, and restrictive, everything from corsets to voluminous skirts and gowns that required multiple attendants to help them get dressed. The very process of dressing took up so much time and effort that there was little opportunity to focus on personal hygiene. But what about the day-to-day care of their bodies? For many royal women, there were very few daily rituals to maintain cleanliness. Bathing, as we've seen, was infrequent, and daily brushing of the hair or teeth was not a routine. In fact, personal grooming was often seen as the responsibility of servants, not something that royalty had to worry about. In a world where appearance mattered above all else, it was far more important to maintain the facade of cleanliness than to actually take the time to engage in thorough personal hygiene. Many royal women would rely on the services of personal attendants to help with grooming. Hair would often be combed, styled, and perfumed, and clothes would be adjusted to ensure that the royal figure appeared immaculate. The idea of self-care or independent hygiene routines was almost unheard of. Royalty was often too busy with political matters, public appearances, and courtly duties to tend to their own hygiene. This reliance on others to maintain personal cleanliness was not just a sign of privilege, but also a reflection of the rigid social structures that separated royalty from the common people. But despite all the layers of beauty rituals and grooming, the lack of focus on the basics, like washing, brushing, or freshening up, often led to unpleasant conditions. Underneath those royal gowns, sweat, dirt, and oils would accumulate on the skin, and the heavy perfumes and powders used to mask unpleasant odors could only do so much. At times, royal women would cover up the reality of their unwashed bodies with layers of cosmetics and fragrance, but the truth of their hygiene, or lack thereof, remained hidden beneath their clothing. The royal court environment also contributed to the neglect of personal hygiene. Living in close quarters with others, often in poorly ventilated spaces, meant that diseases, including skin infections and rashes, were common. In the absence of regular bathing, and with the reliance on heavy perfumes, these infections were often ignored or masked rather than treated. The court was more concerned with maintaining an image of wealth, beauty, and power, and less concerned with the health or well-being of the individuals who inhabited it. Even the royal diet didn't always contribute to good hygiene. While royalty had access to the finest foods and ingredients, their diets were often rich in fats, sugars, and spices that could wreak havoc on their skin and teeth. Without the benefit of modern nutrition, or an understanding of balanced diets, many royal women's health suffered in ways that went beyond what we might consider visible beauty concerns. Their skin would often reflect the imbalance in their diet, with frequent breakouts, redness, and other issues being common. However, in a time when beauty was linked so closely to power, the visible signs of poor health were often hidden beneath layers of makeup or fabric. Moreover, the pressure to maintain an impeccable image didn't just affect the body but also the mind. Many royal women suffered from intense anxiety and stress, knowing that their every move was being scrutinized by the court and the public. This constant pressure to be perfect contributed to a lack of self-care, as the emphasis was always on maintaining the illusion of cleanliness and beauty, rather than caring for themselves in a healthy, holistic manner. Historians still debate how much of this hygiene neglect was due to ignorance, and how much was the result of deliberate social structures designed to keep royal women as symbols of idealized beauty. Some believe that royal women were simply unaware of the health risks associated with their beauty practices, while others argue that the societal norms of the time placed so much emphasis on outward appearance that hygiene was simply an afterthought. Ultimately, the daily hygiene routines, or lack thereof, of royal women tell us a great deal about the standards of the time. In a world where public image was everything, hygiene was secondary. The performance of beauty, wealth and power took precedence over personal well-being, and it was far more important to appear clean and immaculate than to actually practice cleanliness. For royal women, maintaining the facade of perfection was an exhausting and often unhealthy job. In conclusion, the daily hygiene routines of royal women were built around the concept of appearance, not cleanliness. They relied on servants and attendants to help maintain the illusion of cleanliness, and the reality of their hygiene practices was often hidden beneath layers of clothing, makeup, and perfume. The pressure to maintain an image of perfection led to neglect in basic personal care, and the royals, despite their wealth and status, were often subjected to unhealthy and unsanitary conditions. This cultural obsession with outward beauty and appearance ultimately came at the cost of personal well-being and health. Now that we've uncovered the hygiene habits of royal women in their daily routines, let's take a look at how these practices affected their health and well-being in the long run. You might think that the wealth and status enjoyed by these women would shield them from the consequences of poor hygiene, but in reality, their health was often compromised in ways that would be shocking to modern eyes. Despite access to skilled physicians and the finest resources, the lack of proper hygiene and sanitation led to a multitude of health issues that plagued royal women throughout history. One of the most significant and often overlooked issues was the spread of infectious diseases. Royal courts were notorious for being breeding grounds for illness. While most people in the royal courts lived in close proximity, their access to wealth, power and luxury could not protect them from the diseases that thrived in unsanitary environments. Poor hygiene and lack of sanitation were rampant in royal households, where bathing was infrequent and personal hygiene was largely neglected. In many royal courts, particularly in the medieval and Renaissance periods, the absence of modern knowledge about germs and disease transmission meant that royal women were often susceptible to illnesses that could have easily been prevented with proper hygiene practices. These women, who were expected to look immaculate and remain in good health for public appearances and royal duties, were often plagued by chronic health problems caused by poor sanitation. One of the most common afflictions royal women faced due to poor hygiene was skin infections. In an era when regular bathing wasn't the norm, skin conditions such as rashes, boils, and scabies were widespread. These infections were often exacerbated by the heavy clothing worn by royal women, which trapped sweat and oils against the skin. The lack of proper ventilation in their clothing, combined with the application of perfume and makeup to mask the smell of unwashed bodies, only made things worse. Skin conditions were so prevalent that many royal women would seek out various remedies, including herbal baths and ointments, but the core issue of poor hygiene was never addressed. Another issue that was often ignored was dental health. As we've seen, the royal women's approach to oral hygiene was dismal. The absence of regular toothbrushing and the use of harmful substances like lead-based cosmetics and mercury-filled mouthwashes meant that many royal women suffered from severe tooth decay, gum disease, and bad breath. The fact that many royal women also wore elaborate gold-covered dental devices only masked the underlying issue: poor oral hygiene. In some cases, these dental issues caused severe pain and infections that, without modern medicine, could have led to serious health complications. Beyond external health issues, royal women also suffered from mental and emotional distress due to their neglect of personal hygiene. The pressure to maintain an image of perfection was overwhelming, and many royal women were under constant scrutiny. The expectation that they would remain beautiful, poised, and healthy at all times took a significant toll on their mental well-being. The constant performance of royalty, combined with the physical discomforts caused by poor hygiene, left many women emotionally drained and suffering from anxiety, depression, and isolation. One of the most tragic consequences of the poor hygiene practices in royal courts was the effect on fertility and childbirth. We've already discussed the lack of sanitary conditions surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, but the health risks associated with childbirth were even more dire when combined with the unsanitary conditions in which royal women were often forced to deliver their children. The lack of proper prenatal care, coupled with the primitive medical practices of the time, led to many women experiencing complications during pregnancy, including miscarriage, infection, and death. In fact, many royal women did not survive childbirth, and those who did often suffered from lasting health issues due to the lack of hygiene and proper medical care. Even when royal women survived childbirth, the aftermath was often equally grim. The postpartum period was marked by a lack of proper care, as many women were forced to remain in unsanitary conditions and were given little help in recovering from the physical toll of childbirth. The use of unwashed linens and the absence of clean, private spaces contributed to the spread of infections, leading to serious complications. This, combined with the pressure to resume royal duties quickly, made recovery a difficult and sometimes dangerous process. In some cases, these hygiene health issues were even exacerbated by the medical treatments prescribed by royal physicians. As we've seen in previous sections, many royal women underwent dangerous beauty and health treatments, such as the use of lead-based cosmetics, mercury ointments, and bloodletting. These treatments, which were believed to improve health or beauty, often caused long-term damage to the royal women who underwent them. The lack of understanding about basic hygiene and health led to unnecessary suffering for these women, and in many cases, their health declined as a result. Historians still argue whether the health problems suffered by royal women were a direct result of their hygiene practices or whether they were simply the result of the medical ignorance of the time. While both factors certainly played a role, it's clear that the neglect of basic hygiene contributed significantly to the health issues that plagued royal women throughout history. The constant pressure to maintain an image of beauty and perfection, combined with the lack of attention to personal care, created a perfect storm of physical and mental health challenges for these women. In conclusion, the health and well-being of royal women were often compromised by their neglect of basic hygiene practices. From skin infections to dental issues, mental distress to childbirth complications, the consequences of poor hygiene were widespread and deeply damaging. Despite their wealth and status, royal women were not immune to the health risks that came with living in unsanitary conditions. The pursuit of beauty, status, and political power often overshadowed their need for self-care and personal hygiene, leading to long-term health problems that affected their lives in profound ways. The irony is that despite the opulence of their surroundings, their hygiene practices were often far from pristine, and their health suffered as a result. As we've seen, royal women's health and hygiene were deeply impacted by their environments and the practices of their time, leading to significant physical and emotional tolls. But what about the psychological effects of the constant pressure to maintain the illusion of cleanliness, beauty, and perfection? For royal women, life was a performance, a constant balancing act between their personal well-being and their public persona. The pressure to meet these high expectations often resulted in mental distress, isolation, and a lack of autonomy. Despite their wealth, power, and privilege, royal women often led lives filled with stress, anxiety, and frustration. The first and most significant factor contributing to their mental health struggles was the pressure to maintain an idealized image. From the moment they were born, royal women were groomed for a life in the public eye. They were expected to embody the ideals of beauty, grace, and power at all times, no matter what physical or emotional toll it took. This pressure was compounded by the fact that their appearance was often directly tied to their social and political value. The weight of these expectations could be overwhelming, and many royal women struggled with feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and depression as a result. But the pressure didn't stop at appearance. Royal women were often forced to conform to strict societal norms that dictated every aspect of their lives. They were expected to marry strategically, bear children, and maintain a perfect image of royal life. Their personal desires, needs, and emotions were often disregarded in favor of fulfilling their roles as political tools. This lack of agency and autonomy contributed to feelings of isolation, as these women were frequently trapped in a life they didn't choose or control. In many royal courts, women were not allowed to make decisions about their own bodies or lives. They were married off to secure alliances, and their roles as wives and mothers were prioritized above all else. Many royal women had little say in their own marriages or reproductive choices, and their personal happiness was often sacrificed for political gain. This sense of powerlessness only added to the emotional strain they already faced, as they were forced to suppress their own desires and needs for the sake of the monarchy. Another significant aspect of royal women's mental health struggles was the intense scrutiny they faced from the public and the court. Every word, every gesture, and every appearance was carefully observed and criticized. In a world where reputation was everything, royal women had little privacy or personal freedom. The constant public scrutiny could lead to feelings of anxiety and paranoia, as every mistake or imperfection was magnified and used against them. They were expected to maintain a perfect image, even if that meant hiding the reality of their personal lives behind a facade of beauty, grace, and control. The impact of this public scrutiny was particularly evident when it came to matters of health and appearance. If a royal woman showed signs of aging, illness, or imperfection, it was seen as a failure, both personally and politically. In many cases, this led to extreme measures being taken to maintain an image of youth and beauty, such as dangerous beauty treatments, the use of toxic cosmetics, and even drastic weight loss methods. The obsession with maintaining perfection often took precedence over health and well-being, and the psychological toll was profound. Perhaps the most tragic example of the mental distress faced by royal women was the phenomenon of royal loneliness. Despite being surrounded by courtiers, attendants, and family members, many royal women experienced profound loneliness and isolation. This was especially true for those who were married into foreign courts, or those who had been forced into arranged marriages. They were often cut off from their families and familiar surroundings, and their only source of companionship was their immediate court circle, who were often more concerned with political maneuvering than personal connection. In addition to this emotional isolation, many royal women suffered from the fear of losing their position and power. Royalty was precarious, and a failure to produce heirs or maintain the appearance of a perfect life could result in exile, imprisonment, or worse. This constant fear of losing everything led to a state of perpetual anxiety for many royal women, who lived with the knowledge that their lives were governed by forces far beyond their control. Mental health challenges were also compounded by the fact that royal women were often seen as commodities rather than individuals with their own desires and needs. They were expected to bear children, secure alliances, and support the monarchy, but their personal happiness was rarely considered. Many royal women found solace in small acts of rebellion or indulgence, but these were often short-lived and were sometimes dangerous. The sheer lack of agency and control in their lives left many royal women feeling trapped and powerless. Historians have debated the mental health of royal women, with some suggesting that their psychological struggles were an inevitable consequence of the strict, demanding nature of their roles. Others argue that the physical and mental toll of royal life, coupled with a lack of personal autonomy, made these women vulnerable to depression, anxiety, and even suicidal tendencies. The psychological burden of living in a gilded cage was profound, and many royal women paid the price in terms of their mental health. In conclusion, the mental health struggles of royal women were often the result of the overwhelming pressure to maintain an idealized image, the lack of personal autonomy, and the constant public scrutiny they faced. Despite their wealth and power, they were often trapped in lives that were controlled by external forces, leaving little room for personal happiness or well-being. The psychological toll of their roles was profound, and many royal women suffered in silence, their mental distress hidden behind layers of makeup, elaborate clothing, and public performances. The truth is that the lives of these women, despite their outward opulence, were often far from the fairy tale existence we imagine. They were subject to a world of beauty standards, societal expectations, and emotional isolation that took a heavy toll on their mental and physical health. As we continue to unravel the complex and often grim reality of royal women's hygiene and health practices, it's time to shift our focus to the role of social customs and courtly expectations in shaping their behaviors. Throughout history, royal women were not just tasked with managing their personal lives, but were also expected to embody the ideals of the monarchy. The notion of royalty was intricately tied to societal standards and expectations, many of which dictated their public and private behavior, including their hygiene. At the heart of this pressure was the concept of royal image. The image of the royal family, and particularly royal women, was paramount to the success and stability of the monarchy. It wasn't enough to simply maintain an outward appearance of wealth and power. They were expected to project an image of purity, grace, and even divine favor. This expectation often led to strange practices that had little to do with cleanliness or health, and everything to do with maintaining a symbolic representation of royal dignity. For instance, in many royal courts, the idea of bathing was frowned upon, not because it wasn't essential to personal hygiene, but because it was believed that frequent bathing was unbecoming for a royal figure. Some believed that water could open the body to evil spirits, while others thought that water removed the body's natural oils, which were considered a symbol of nobility and dignity. In royal circles, perfume was often used to cover up the smell of unwashed bodies, while a pristine appearance was more important than health or cleanliness. The royal image became so deeply ingrained in society that even basic hygiene practices were put aside for the sake of maintaining an illusion. This obsession with image extended to all aspects of royal women's lives, including their clothing, behavior, and even personal relationships. Clothing was a major symbol of status, and royal women were expected to wear elaborate, expensive gowns, which required a great deal of upkeep. However, the luxurious fabrics used in these garments often made hygiene difficult. The weight of the clothing and the tight corsets worn by many royal women caused discomfort and restricted their movement, making it hard for them to tend to basic hygiene needs. But the importance of maintaining an image of elegance outweighed personal comfort. The tighter the corset, the more structured the gown, the more royal the appearance. Cleanliness was secondary. The pressure to maintain this image often extended to royal marriages and personal relationships. Royal women were typically married for political reasons, and their ability to produce heirs was viewed as one of their most important duties. The personal emotions or health of royal women often took a back seat to political alliances and dynastic concerns. In these highly controlled relationships, royal women were often isolated, both emotionally and physically. Their personal desires were often disregarded in favor of ensuring that they met the expectations of the monarchy and produced heirs, which frequently led to emotional strain and a lack of mental well-being. In addition to being constrained by these social expectations, royal women were constantly subject to judgment and scrutiny by those around them. This scrutiny extended to their physical appearance, behavior, and hygiene. While the elite of society were often afforded the privilege of covering up or masking their faults, royal women were expected to be flawless. Any imperfection, whether it be a physical flaw, a health issue, or a lapse in their appearance, could result in criticism, scandal, or even political repercussions. The fear of judgment created a sense of constant anxiety, pushing royal women to prioritize image over everything else, even their own health and comfort. This cycle of public performance, image maintenance, and personal neglect created a breeding ground for mental and physical distress. Royal women were often subjected to unrealistic standards of beauty, behavior, and hygiene. Their lives were consumed by the need to appear perfect to their subjects, which often meant they were unable to care for themselves in the ways that were necessary for maintaining good health. In royal courts, the culture of image and performance was so entrenched that it overshadowed all other aspects of life, including personal hygiene. Even though these women had access to the finest resources, they were expected to adhere to rigid standards of conduct, including appearances, without much regard for their health or personal well-being. While royals were supposed to be above reproach, they were also human and subject to the same vulnerabilities as anyone else. Except their flaws were often hidden under layers of cosmetics, clothing, and political obligations. Historians still debate the degree to which royal women were aware of the toll these pressures took on their health and well-being. Some believe they were largely oblivious to the dangers of their beauty practices and hygiene neglect, while others argue that they were well aware but had little choice in the matter. For royal women, maintaining their image wasn't simply a choice, it was an obligation. Their roles as symbols of power, wealth, and purity often left them with little room to address their personal health or mental well-being. Ultimately, these customs and expectations painted royal women into a corner. They were expected to represent the perfect image of monarchy, but in doing so, they sacrificed their own health, comfort, and happiness. The public perception of royalty was everything, and to maintain that image, they endured painful beauty rituals, unsanitary living conditions, and the constant stress of performing for their subjects. This cultural obsession with maintaining a perfect image of royalty, no matter the cost, was a driving force behind the hygiene neglect and mental health struggles that plagued many royal women throughout history. In conclusion, the role of social customs and courtly expectations in shaping royal women's behavior and hygiene practices cannot be overstated. Their lives were governed by the need to maintain an image of perfection, and as a result, their personal health and well-being were often sacrificed. While they had the resources to live comfortably and access the best care, the social norms and expectations of royalty led them to neglect their own needs. The obsession with appearance, image, and political power dictated every aspect of their lives, including their hygiene habits, leading to long-term consequences for their health and happiness. As we've journeyed through the troubling hygiene habits of royal women, one major question arises: how did these practices evolve, and when did they begin to change? The transformation of hygiene in royal courts wasn't immediate, and it didn't happen because royalty suddenly embraced the importance of personal cleanliness. Instead, it took centuries for a combination of scientific discovery, cultural shifts, and changing political dynamics to slowly push royal women toward more modern hygiene practices. One of the first significant changes came in the 18th century, when the rise of the Enlightenment brought about a greater focus on reason, science, and health. During this time, physicians began to understand more about the importance of sanitation and hygiene in preventing disease. It wasn't just about beauty and outward appearance anymore, it was about health and well-being. But while these new ideas were gaining traction in the scientific community, they didn't immediately change the daily practices in royal courts. hygiene was still seen as secondary to status, and royal women continued to rely on perfume and powders to mask the reality of their personal cleanliness. However, as the 19th century approached, a few key shifts began to change the tide. The development of indoor plumbing and the rise of public health movements gradually began to encourage a more systematic approach to personal hygiene. These changes were not exclusive to royalty. Ordinary people also began to adopt better hygiene practices. But for royal women, it wasn't just about personal care. It was also about status and image. As these changes became more mainstream, so too did the idea that personal cleanliness was a sign of good health, wealth, and modernity. The first real visible sign of change came with the Victorians. Queen Victoria herself, who reigned over Britain from 1837 to 1901, was instrumental in reshaping attitudes toward cleanliness. During her reign, the royal court began to adopt a much more regimented approach to personal hygiene. Bathing, which had been a rare and often discouraged activity in earlier centuries, became much more common. Victorian ideals placed a strong emphasis on modesty and respectability, which included maintaining proper hygiene. Queen Victoria is known to have been a firm believer in regular bathing, and her example helped establish a new cultural norm in the royal court. Simultaneously, the introduction of soap-making techniques and the mass production of soap during the Victorian era made personal hygiene more accessible to all levels of society. Royal women, who had once relied on perfumes and powders to cover up their lack of cleanliness, began to use soap regularly as part of their daily routines. This marked a shift from the superficial masking of odors to actual cleansing of the body. However, even with these advancements, royal women's hygiene practices still lagged behind the changes that were happening in the broader population. Another major turning point came with the development of modern medical knowledge. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the discovery of germs and the advent of modern medicine profoundly impacted hygiene practices. The understanding that hygiene was critical to preventing disease became ingrained in society. While the monarchy and its courtiers had been slow to adopt these principles, the influence of public health campaigns and scientific advancements could no longer be ignored. The growing availability of water, the use of proper sanitation systems, and the increasing awareness of the dangers of poor hygiene meant that even royal women could no longer continue to neglect their personal care. As royal courts moved into the 20th century, hygiene became more than just a matter of beauty. It became a matter of health. With the development of more effective cleaning products and the establishment of private bathrooms in royal palaces, the hygienic standards of royal women improved drastically. While some old customs persisted, the public image of royalty began to reflect the emerging standards of cleanliness and personal care. By this time, royal women were no longer seen as symbols of untouchable purity, but as women who, like the rest of society, had to adhere to modern practices of hygiene. But even with these changes, royal women continued to face the same pressures to maintain their appearance and uphold their status. While the tools for personal hygiene had evolved, the cultural obsession with image and perfection remained a constant force. Even today, the royal family, while practicing modern hygiene, still has to adhere to a very specific set of standards and expectations when it comes to appearance and behavior. As we look back at the history of royal women's hygiene practices, it's clear that while their wealth and status protected them from many of the hardships faced by the common folk, they were not immune to the consequences of poor hygiene. The pursuit of beauty and perfection, the obsession with maintaining an idealized image of royalty, and the lack of modern health knowledge all contributed to a legacy of neglect that affected their personal well-being in profound ways. However, the gradual shift toward better hygiene practices in the royal courts serves as a reminder that even those who seem untouchable, those who live in palaces and wear crowns, are still subject to the realities of health, illness, and the need for self-care. It wasn't until scientific and cultural revolutions began to take place that royal women were finally able to embrace hygiene in a way that improved their health and well-being. Today, the modern royal family has access to the same hygiene practices and health care as the general population, and their image now reflects a much healthier, more balanced approach to self-care. In conclusion, the history of royal women's hygiene is a fascinating journey through time, a story of beauty rituals, cultural expectations, and evolving medical knowledge. From the dangerous use of toxic cosmetics to the slow but steady adoption of modern hygiene practices, royal women were not immune to the effects of neglecting personal care. Their story is a testament to the power of image, the limits of wealth, and the ever-changing nature of health and hygiene. It serves as a reminder that even in the most opulent of settings, the pursuit of perfection can sometimes come at the expense of well-being.